The elevator doors had barely closed when the lights went out. Four men in black tactical gear materialized from the shadows of the underground parking garage, moving with the disciplined silence of professionals. Claire Bennett pressed her back against a concrete pillar, her laptop clutched to her chest, heart slamming against her ribs. She opened her mouth to scream. No sound came. Then a figure stepped forward from the darkness. Not from the direction of the exit, but from the corner where the cleaning cart sat parked against the wall. The mop handle moved before anyone fully understood what was happening. 3 seconds later, all four attackers were on the ground. The janitor stood over them, breathing steady, knuckles split, eyes cold as January concrete. And Claire Bennett realized she had never once looked at the man who mopped her floors every single night. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like this one don't come along often, and you don't want to walk in halfway through. Drop a like on this video, and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because Nathan Wolf's story starts long before that parking garage. The Meridian Biosciences building was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small on purpose. 42 floors of glass and steel rising above the financial district, with a lobby that featured a waterfall wall and a receptionist whose job appeared to be smiling at people who already knew they belonged there. The security badges were encoded. The elevators required biometric confirmation above the 20th floor. The cafeteria on the 38th level offered 4 different kinds of oat milk and a rotating menu designed by a chef who had once cooked for a sitting senator. Nathan Wolf worked the night shift, subfloor 2 through floor 8, Sunday through Thursday. His cart was the older model, the one with the left wheel that pulled slightly and made a sound like a playing card in bicycle spokes every time it hit the join between the elevator and the hallway floor. He'd put in a maintenance request for a replacement 3 months ago. Nobody had followed up. He hadn't asked again. That was fine. Nathan Wolf had learned a long time ago not to expect things to be followed up on. He was 37 years old, though most people, when they bothered to look at him at all, guessed somewhere north of 40. Not because he was haggard exactly, but because he carried something in his face that had nothing to do with wrinkles, a kind of settled weight behind the eyes that you only see in people who have made decisions they can't unmake. He kept his hair short out of habit more than preference. His hands were large and marked with scars that he covered without thinking about it, pulling his sleeves down in the elevator, keeping his knuckles facing inward when he pushed the cart. His employee file said he'd worked maintenance for 6 years. It listed a previous employer in coastal Virginia, a property management company that no longer existed, which was convenient. It listed an emergency contact, a woman named Patricia Wolf in Richmond, his mother, who did exist and who he spoke to on Sunday mornings when Liam was eating breakfast, and the apartment felt briefly like a home instead of a holding pattern. His file did not mention the Navy. It did not mention the 8 years that came after basic training. It did not mention a classified operation off the coast of a country whose name still appeared nowhere in any record that Nathan was aware of, or the 3 weeks that followed that operation, or what those 3 weeks had cost him. There was no reason for any of that to be in his file. He was a janitor. Liam was 8 years old and currently in the middle of a very serious argument with a bowl of cereal. "It's getting soggy," he announced, without looking up from the comic book spread open beside his breakfast. "I'm documenting it." "You're documenting cereal deterioration." "For science." Nathan poured himself coffee from the pot he'd set on a timer before his shift, one of the small disciplines he maintained without thinking about, the way former soldiers maintained small disciplines, because structure was the architecture that kept everything else from falling apart. He looked at his son. 8 years old, dark hair that needed cutting, a gap between his front teeth from a baby tooth that had come out 3 weeks ago, and that Liam had placed carefully in a folded piece of paper towel and stored in the top drawer of his nightstand. "You need to eat the cereal, not observe it," Nathan said. "Observation is a form of engagement. Eating is a form of not being hungry." Liam looked up. He had his mother's eyes, a brown so dark it was nearly black, expressive in a way that made Nathan's chest do something complicated when he looked at them too directly. The boy grinned, showing the gap. "You sound tired." "I worked all night." "Were the floors dirty?" "Floors are always dirty." "That's kind of a depressing job, Dad. You clean something and it just gets dirty again." Nathan sat down across from him with the coffee. Outside the apartment window, the city was doing its early morning thing. A delivery truck grinding up the street, pigeons relocating from one ledge to another, the particular shade of gray light that existed for maybe 40 minutes before the sun got its act together. Most things are like that, Nathan said. You still have to clean them. Liam considered this with the gravity of someone who took most things seriously. Then he went back to his comic book and began eating the cereal, which had in fact become quite soggy, without further complaint. Nathan watched him for a moment longer than he needed to. The boy's left hand, wrapped around the spoon, had a faint tremor. Not pronounced. Not the kind of thing you'd notice if you didn't know what you were looking for. But Nathan knew exactly what he was looking for, had cataloged every minor variation in that tremor over the past 14 months. The way he had once cataloged enemy patterns of movement in environments where getting the observation wrong meant not coming home. The tremor was a little worse this morning. He made a note of it in the small notebook he kept on the kitchen counter, the way the neurologist had asked him to, and then he washed the coffee cup and went to sleep. Claire Bennett had not slept. This was not unusual. She had not slept properly in approximately 3 years, which was roughly how long it had taken to get the compound, internally designated MBX7, from theoretical framework to a clinical trial profile that had survived peer review without any of the 15 competing interests invested in its failure managing to get it buried. She was 30 years old, which people in her industry found remarkable, and which she found exhausting to keep being remarkable about. She'd published her first paper at 22, defended her doctoral thesis at 24, turned down 2 acquisition offers from pharmaceutical giants before she was 27, and founded Meridian with 2 co-founders who had since departed, one amicably, one not, leaving her with full operational control, complete accountability, and a board of directors who were beginning to ask pointed questions about the timeline for MBX7's regulatory approval. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office on the 38th floor with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, looking out at a city that was just beginning to wake up, and tried to remember the last time she'd eaten a meal she hadn't taken at her desk. She couldn't. Her assistant Marcus appeared in the doorway. He was 26, organized in the way that naturally organized people are organized, intuitively, without visible effort, and he had learned within his first 2 weeks to read Claire's silhouette as a diagnostic instrument. "Your 7:30 is confirmed," he said. "Dr. Reyes pushed the synthesis review to Thursday, which is good because Patterson from the board is going to want a preliminary—" "Someone accessed Lab C last night," Claire said, without turning around. A pause. "What?" "The environmental controls in Lab C logged an anomalous pressure differential at 2:14 a.m. I got the alert on my phone. By the time security reviewed it, nothing was on camera." She finally turned from the window. She looked like someone who had been awake all night running calculations, which was exactly what she was. The seal log shows Lab C was properly secured at 10 p.m. when Dr. Ito left, but the pressure differential means someone opened the inner door. Could be a sensor glitch. I pulled last month's maintenance records. That sensor has never glitched. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was smart enough to understand what she was not quite saying. "Do you want me to call building security?" "I already called them. They reviewed the camera footage personally. Nothing." Then someone knows where the blind spots are," Claire said, "which means this wasn't random." She picked up the tea finally and took a sip. It was cold. She drank it anyway because she'd learned that waiting for things to be perfect before you engaged with them was how you ended up with nothing. "Reschedule my 7:30, she said. "I need to go down to Lab C myself." Nathan had been watching the lab situation for 11 days before the pressure differential incident. He hadn't meant to notice. Noticing things was just something his nervous system did, a habit so deeply embedded after 8 years of work that required it, that he'd stopped trying to turn it off somewhere around year 4 of civilian life. He noticed the cameras in the subfloor corridors and which ones had adjustable housings that could be nudged a few degrees off their logged field of view. He noticed that the Lab C access corridor had a cleaning schedule gap between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., a gap that had appeared in the schedule rotation about 5 weeks ago, inserted cleanly, without any documentation of who had requested it. He noticed the man he'd mentally labeled Gray Jacket, a facilities contractor whose badge listed him as HVAC maintenance, who appeared on subfloors 1 and 2 roughly every 4 days, always between 9 and 11 p.m., always carrying a bag that was slightly too rigid for the equipment he claimed to be servicing. He'd mentioned Gray Jacket to the building security supervisor once, framed as a casual observation. The security supervisor had looked at him the way people look at janitors who speak without being spoken to first, nodded, and changed the subject. Nathan had not brought it up again. Instead, he started adjusting his route. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register on the cleaning log timestamps, which he was careful to maintain. But he started moving through the Lab C corridor on his own time, outside his logged route, using the access he had because nobody thought twice about where the cleaning cart went at 3 in the morning. I was in the stairwell adjacent to parking sublevel 2 when he heard Claire Bennett come out of the elevator. He heard the other 4 men, too. The thing about violence is that most people freeze in the first instant of it. Not from cowardice, from processing delay. The brain is running threat assessment, running scenario outcomes, running the logical audit of is this actually happening? And while it's running all of that, the seconds are moving without you. Nathan had trained that delay out of himself so long ago he couldn't remember what it felt like to have it. What he saw in the half second before he moved, 4 men, tactical gear, under civilian jackets, moving in a pattern that indicated rehearsed coordination. Claire against the pillar, laptop in arms, back to concrete. The position of someone who'd made the correct tactical choice without knowing it was tactical. 4-1, closing spread, no visible firearms, which meant the directive was likely capture or controlled elimination rather than a quick kill. But likely wasn't certainly, and the distinction would become irrelevant fast. He picked up the mop handle as he came around the cart. The first man didn't see him until the handle connected with his forearm at the joint, the specific point where the radial nerve runs close to the surface, and the arm went briefly useless. Nathan stepped through the stumble, used the man's own forward momentum, redirected him into the second attacker with enough force to put both of them on the ground in a tangle that would take several seconds to resolve. The third man was fast. He'd reset and was reaching for something at his waist. Nathan dropped low under the grab, came up inside the man's guard, one controlled strike to the jaw that was enough to disconnect him from conscious decision-making for 30 seconds. The fourth backed up, reassessing. His eyes went to his 3 incapacitated colleagues, and then back to the janitor standing over them, breathing steady, holding a mop handle the way most people hold a weapon. Nathan looked at him. "Don't," he said. The word was quiet. It had no particular heat in it. It was the word of someone who was not angry, not performing, not issuing a warning because they thought it might be declined. Just someone stating a fact about how the next 30 seconds would go if a certain choice was made. The fourth man ran. Nathan let him go. Pursuit meant leaving Claire alone in a parking garage with 3 men who were going to regain consciousness in the next 2 to 4 minutes, and those numbers didn't work in her favor. He kept the math simple. He always kept the math simple. He turned around. Claire Bennett was standing exactly where he'd last seen her, laptop still against her chest, staring at him. She had not screamed, which he noted as data about her. She was clearly terrified. He could see that in the set of her shoulders, the controlled breathing she was doing, the particular stillness of someone whose body was still in full adrenaline response, but whose mind had taken operational control. But she hadn't screamed, and she hadn't run, and she hadn't done any of the things that would have complicated his ability to handle the situation. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She blinked. "Are you?" She looked at his knuckles. His right hand was bleeding where the skin had split across 2 knuckles, an old scar site that reopened on contact more easily than it used to. "You're bleeding." "It's minor." He was already moving toward the stairwell access panel. "We need to move you to a secure interior location before the one who ran reports back." "Do you have your phone?" "Yes." "Call security directly, not through the building switchboard." He glanced back at her. "The switchboard routes through a desk that may be monitored." She stared at him. He understood the stare. He'd been a janitor for 6 years. Janitors did not typically know things about switchboard monitoring vulnerabilities. "Mr. What's your name?" she managed. "Wolf. Nathan Wolf." "Mr. Wolf." She swallowed. Her voice was remarkably steady, actually. "Who are you?" It was a reasonable question. He didn't answer it. "The stairwell's safer than the elevator right now," he said. "Second floor has an interior security station. Can you walk?" She straightened up from the pillar, pushed her hair back with one hand, looked at him with an expression he'd seen before. The look of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Yes, she said. I can walk. The police took 4 hours. Or rather, the police arrived in 12 minutes, which was fine, but the process of statements and scene documentation and the particular institutional friction of getting anyone to take seriously the idea that a coordinated four-man attack on a biotech CEO in her own building's parking structure might constitute an ongoing threat rather than a resolved incident. That took 4 hours. Nathan gave his statement to a Detective Rosario, who was competent and thorough, and who looked at Nathan's employee file with the expression of someone who knew something wasn't adding up but couldn't locate the specific discrepancy. Nathan answered every question accurately. He was careful to answer only the questions asked. You took down 3 trained attackers with a cleaning implement, Rosario said at the end, in the tone of someone reading from a document that had been written by someone else. I had the element of surprise. Right. Rosario clicked his pen, looked at Nathan. You have any martial arts training, Mr. Wolf? Some. Rosario waited. Nathan waited. This was a thing Nathan was extremely good at, waiting. And after 11 seconds, Rosario wrote something in his notebook and moved on. At 6:30 in the morning, after the police had finished with her, after HR had been notified, after her board chair had called twice, and she had let both calls go to voicemail, Claire found Nathan in the hallway outside the security station. He was sitting in a plastic chair with his cleaning cart parked beside him, filling out an incident form in handwriting that was small and precise, the letters evenly spaced in a way that looked less like someone who'd learned penmanship and more like someone who'd learned to write in conditions where clarity was functional. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. She sat down in the chair beside his. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Down the hall, a security guard was talking quietly on his radio. A fluorescent tube was flickering every few seconds with the particular randomness of a dying bulb. The building was beginning to come alive above them. She could feel it in the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of the freight elevator. Thank you, she said. He nodded. The nod was not dismissive exactly, but it was the nod of a man who wasn't comfortable accepting things he considered simply functional. A task had presented itself, the task was resolved. Gratitude was not really the appropriate response category. You knew they were there before they moved, she said. You came out of that corner like you'd been watching them. He was quiet for a moment. I was in the stairwell, he said. I heard the elevator. You heard 4 men in tactical gear coming off an elevator and you picked up a mop handle. A beat. It was available, he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes without looking away or looking too hard. The particular quality of eye contact that belonged to someone who had nothing to hide, but also nothing to offer you beyond the precise truth of what they were saying. What did you do before this? She asked. His jaw moved slightly. Not a flinch, just the smallest recalibration. Property management, he said. Claire Bennett had built a pharmaceutical company on a foundation of knowing when data didn't fit its stated model. She knew what a narrative that didn't fit its data looked like. She didn't push. I'm going to have building security review the entire access protocol for Lab C, she said instead. The attack tonight wasn't random. Someone's been inside this building, and they knew exactly where my cameras weren't watching. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Lab C's exterior corridor has a schedule gap, he said. 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. It's been in the rotation for about 5 weeks. He paused. The HVAC contractor who services subfloor 2, the one with the gray jacket, he shouldn't be down there. Claire stared at him. How do you know that? He carries a bag, Nathan said simply. The tools in a real HVAC service bag move around when you carry it. His don't. The fluorescent tube flickered. Down the hall, the security guard was still talking into his radio, low and unhurried, like a man who thought the excitement was finished. Claire looked at the man sitting beside her, at the split knuckles wrapped in a strip of paper towel he'd taped off himself, at the worn edge of his maintenance uniform collar, at the eyes that were the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal more of the world than this parking garage. She made a decision. Mr. Wolf, she said, I'm going to need to ask you to come back in tomorrow night. He looked at her. I already work tomorrow night, he said. I know, she said. But now I'm asking you to pay attention. He was quiet for a long moment. In the corridor, the fluorescent tube gave one final flicker and then steadied, as if it had decided something. "I always pay attention," Nathan Wolfe said. And for the first time since the parking garage, sitting in a plastic chair under a bad light at 6:30 in the morning with paper towel wrapped around his bleeding hand, he almost looked like a man who wasn't carrying the weight of an entire buried life across his shoulders. Almost. The gray jacket was gone by Thursday. Nathan noticed the absence the same way he noticed everything. Not with alarm exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that registers a change in pattern the way a shift in wind registers before a storm. The HVAC contractor had been running his 4-day rotation like clockwork for 5 weeks. Then 2 days after the parking garage, the rotation simply stopped. No replacement, no scheduled follow-up. The access log for subfloor 2 showed his badge had been deactivated, which meant someone inside the company's security administration had killed it and had done so quietly without filing the standard contractor termination documentation that Nathan had learned to locate in the maintenance office's shared drive. He didn't say anything about it immediately. Instead, he noted it in the small composition notebook he kept in the interior pocket of his uniform jacket, the one that looked battered enough to be personal enough that nobody ever asked to look at it. He wrote the date, the time he'd confirmed the badge deactivation, and a single question mark beside the contractor's name, which he'd lifted from the subfloor access register 3 weeks earlier. D. Ferris, HVAC, contracted through a facilities management company called Crestline Services, whose website, when Nathan had looked it up on the library computer he occasionally used, had the particular quality of professional websites that exist primarily to make something look legitimate. Detailed enough to pass a casual glance, thin enough that nothing on it was verifiable. He had not told Claire about Crestline yet. He was still deciding how much to tell her, and how fast and in what order. Information had weight, and releasing it too quickly or without the right framing created problems. He'd learned that in environments where releasing bad information badly could get people killed. The stakes here were different in their specifics, but not, he was beginning to understand, in their structure. Claire had spent the 2 days since the parking garage doing 3 things simultaneously, which was not unusual for her, except that now one of the 3 things was something she'd never had to do before. She was trying to figure out how scared to be. The police had filed the incident under assault, ongoing investigation, and Detective Rosario had called once to confirm they'd identified one of the 3 men from the parking garage through fingerprints. The man's name was Owen Tresser, and he had a record that included 2 prior arrests for aggravated assault and 1 conviction that had been reduced on appeal. He was currently not in custody. Rosario had said this in the tone of someone who understood how unsatisfying that information was, but had no alternative to offer. The board chair, Gerald Sutton, had called 3 times and eventually stopped leaving voicemails and sent a carefully worded email suggesting that perhaps Claire should consider engaging personal security professionals for the interim period. Gerald Sutton was 64 years old, had made his money in medical devices, and had the particular habit of wealthy men who'd spent decades insulated from consequence. He spoke about danger the way people speak about weather, as a condition that could be managed with the right services if you could afford them. Claire had replied that she was taking appropriate precautions and would update the board after the quarterly review. What she had actually done was pull every access and environmental log she could access for Lab C going back 90 days, spread them across 3 monitors, and start looking for the shape of something that shouldn't be there. It took her 14 hours to find it. It was not obvious. Whoever had been in Lab C had been careful in a way that suggested professional training or very sophisticated coaching. The environmental log showed the pressure differential anomaly from that one night, but when Claire cross-referenced the differential readings against the temperature logs, she found 4 additional instances over the past 6 weeks where the temperature in Lab C's secondary antechamber had dropped by 1.3 degrees for intervals between 8 and 14 minutes. Small enough that the automated system flagged nothing. Small enough that it looked like normal HVAC fluctuation unless you were looking at it with the specific suspicion that someone had been using the antechamber door. Someone had been in Lab C at least 5 times before the night they tripped the pressure sensor. The 5th time, the night of the sensor, they'd apparently been careless, or rushed, or both. The question was what they had been doing in there. Claire pulled the synthesis batch records for MBX7. The compound was at a critical juncture. The final formulation stability testing that would determine whether the drug could be manufactured at scale without the molecular degradation that had killed 2 previous iterations. The batch records looked clean on their face, but clean on its face was what a sabotaged record looked like when whoever had done the sabotaging knew what they were doing. She called Dr. Ito at 7 in the morning. Dr. Kenji Ito was 51 years old, had been with Meridian since the company's second year, and was the only person other than Claire who fully understood what MBX7 was supposed to do at the molecular level. He answered the phone the way he answered everything, with the careful attention of someone who had been startled before and had learned to present calm as a default setting. "I need you to run an independent verification on the last 4 batch records," Claire said, without preamble. "Don't use the lab system. Use your personal laptop. Document your findings separately." A pause. "Should I ask why?" "I'll explain when you come in. Come in through the side entrance on Callaway Street." Another pause, longer. "Claire, what's happening?" "Someone's been in Lab C," she said, "more than once. And I need to know if they touched our data." "What?" Nathan was running a different kind of audit. He'd been a janitor for 6 years, and in that time he had learned something about buildings that most people who worked in them never understood. Buildings were not static. They breathed. They had rhythms and patterns and small behavioral signatures, and when those signatures changed, the change was always caused by something. A new occupant, a shift in usage, a new purpose being given to an old space. He paid attention to the rhythms of the Meridian building the way he'd once paid attention to the rhythms of hostile environments. And what he was currently registering was a building that had developed a second set of patterns running beneath its official ones, like a second heartbeat slightly out of sync with the first. It started with the freight elevator. The freight elevator serviced the subfloors and the first 4 floors. It was used for equipment delivery, waste removal, and the occasional after-hours material transfer that various departments scheduled through building management. Nathan had the freight elevator schedule because he used it himself to move cleaning supplies. He knew what a normal week of freight traffic looked like. For the past 6 weeks, there had been 1 additional freight elevator usage per week that appeared in the physical log at the basement level but did not appear in the digital scheduling system. It was always on a Tuesday, always between 10 p.m. and midnight, always logged by hand in the physical book as routine maintenance transfer with no department code and no authorizing signature beyond an illegible initial. Physical log. No digital record. No signature. Every Tuesday. Nathan had written this down on a Tuesday, and then, this past Tuesday, had positioned himself at the subfloor junction point with a reason to be there. A blocked floor drain that he'd documented in his maintenance request system 3 days earlier, creating a legitimate audit trail for his presence. He'd been crouched over the drain cover with a cleaning solution and a probe tool when the freight elevator came down. 2 men had come out with a sealed equipment case, the kind used for biological transport. They'd gone down the south corridor, away from Lab C, which he'd expected, but toward the server closet that housed Meridian's internal research data backup system. He hadn't followed them. Following would have meant being seen, and being seen would have ended his utility in the situation. He'd stayed with the drain, listened to the sounds the corridor gave him, footsteps, the beep of an access card reader, a door, silence, 7 minutes, the door again, footsteps, the freight elevator. And when they were gone, he'd walked to the server closet door and looked at the access log panel. The panel logged card swipes by badge number. The last entry showed badge number 7741. He'd looked up 7741 in the contractor roster that hung on the maintenance office wall. It belonged to D. Ferris, the badge that had supposedly been deactivated 2 days ago. He found Claire at her desk at 11:15 that night, which was where she was most evenings when he came through on his floor 8 pass. He'd learned her rhythms, the way she worked in sustained blocks rather than consistent hours, the way she kept her office door cracked open when she was in a state of sustained focus, as opposed to the closed-door isolation she used for calls and meetings. The cracked door meant she was working and could be interrupted, in the same way that a cracked door in certain other environments had meant something was clear and it was safe to proceed. He knocked once and waited. "Come in." She looked up from her monitors, and in the few days since the parking garage, something had shifted in the way she looked at him. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the recalibrated attention of someone who had updated their mental model of a person and was still adjusting to the new version. She didn't make it uncomfortable. That was one of the things Nathan had noticed about her. She made new information her own quickly, without drama. "I need to show you something," he said. He closed the door behind him, which he had not done before, and she registered that without commenting on it. He took out the composition notebook and set it on the edge of her desk. Not in front of her, to the side, giving her the choice to reach for it. "The contractor, Ferris. His badge was deactivated 3 days ago." She nodded. "Security confirmed that to me. He used it last night." She went still. "The physical freight log in the basement shows a Tuesday night transfer that doesn't match any entry in your digital scheduling system," Nathan continued. "Going back 6 weeks. Always a Tuesday. Always the same hand-logged entry format. Last night, I was at the subfloor junction when 2 men came down. One of them used badge 7741 to access the server room that houses your backup research data." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "The backup server?" "Yes." "Not Lab C?" "No." He met her eyes. They moved away from Lab C the moment it got flagged. The Lab C access was the avenue they burned when it got compromised. The server room is the secondary route. She leaned back in her chair and put both hands over her face for 3 seconds. Not in panic, he thought, but in the way of someone doing a rapid internal calculation in the dark. Then she dropped her hands and looked at him. "You've been watching this building," she said. "I work here." "Nathan." She said his name with the particular weight of someone using a first name deliberately, as a statement rather than a habit. "I need you to tell me who you are." He looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I was in the Navy," he said. "I left. I have a son." He paused. "That's the part that's relevant. The part that—" She stopped. Tried again. "You think what's happening here is connected to your son?" "No." He picked up the notebook. "But what's happening here matters to my son. And what matters to my son is relevant." She studied him. He could tell she was deciding how hard to push, weighing what she knew against what she needed, doing the same kind of quiet math he did himself. He respected it. "MBX7, she said finally. "Do you know what it does?" "It's your neurological treatment compound, the one the company was built around." "It doesn't just treat neurological conditions," she said. "It targets a specific class of pediatric progressive neurological disorders, the ones that current medications can slow but can't stop, the ones that take children apart one system at a time over years until nothing's left that wasn't already broken." She said it plainly, without decoration, the way people describe things they've lived with long enough that the horror of them has become simply factual. "If MBX7 works the way my trial data says it works, it's the first compound in 30 years that doesn't just manage symptoms. It reverses the degradation." Nathan was quiet. Something moved across his face. She saw it, even though he controlled it within half a second. Something that was not professional and not calculated, and came from a place beneath all of that. "Your son," she said softly. "What does he have?" The silence in the office was total. Down the corridor, the ventilation system moved air through its ducts. Outside the windows, the city was doing what cities did at 11 in the evening, indifferent and continuous and enormous. "Progressive cerebellar ataxia," Nathan said. "Pediatric onset. He's 8. A pause. "His name is Liam." She looked at him for a long moment. "MBX7 targets that specific pathway," she said. "The cerebellar degradation mechanism. That's—" She stopped. "Nathan, that's exactly what it was designed to address." He already knew this. He'd known it for 4 months, since a neurologist at Liam's hospital had mentioned the Meridian trial in the careful way doctors mention things they can't officially recommend because the approval timeline was uncertain and the waiting list was managed by the company. He'd looked up Claire Bennett the same day. He'd taken the Meridian maintenance position 2 weeks later through a temp agency that didn't ask too many questions about employment gaps. He'd been watching over her for 4 months without any intention of ever telling her why. "The sabotage," he said, pulling them back to the notebook. "I think there are at least 2 tracks. One is the research data. Whoever's accessing the backup server is either extracting your synthesis parameters or introducing corrupted data into the backup, so that if your primary system is ever compromised, you'll restore from a poisoned backup. The second track is harder." He hesitated. "I think there's someone inside the company, not a contractor. Someone with legitimate standing who's managing the external access. She didn't flinch. What makes you think that? The blind spots in the camera coverage. Someone who's inside the security administration adjusted the camera housings in 3 of the parking subfloor cameras over the past 2 months. It's in the maintenance physical log. Routine adjustment for optimal angle. No work order. Whoever did it knew exactly which angles to move them to create the coverage gap you had last night. He looked at her steadily. That's not a contractor who came in on Tuesdays. That's someone who's here every day. Claire stood up from her desk. She walked to the window, not the grand floor-to-ceiling panorama of the 38th floor, but the smaller side window of her evening workspace, which looked out over the building's east face and the street below. She stood there with her arms crossed and her back to him for 30 seconds, and when she turned around, her face had resolved into the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion they didn't like and were choosing to accept it anyway. I have a board meeting in 6 days, she said. If the regulatory submission for MBX7 gets delayed again because the trial data is questioned, the board has the votes to bring in an outside management firm, effectively replacing me. She said this without self-pity, just as a piece of the architecture of the situation. If that happens, the pricing structure I've locked into the company's charter, the one that keeps MBX7 affordable for families who don't have insurance coverage, gets reviewed. And the board's majority interest is aligned with our largest institutional shareholder, who also has a position in 3 competing compounds that MBX7 would eliminate from the market. Nathan processed this. So the sabotage doesn't have to destroy the drug. It just has to delay it long enough. Until the board can act, she said. Yes. How long? 6 days, she said. If our regulatory submission is clean and on time, the board loses its justification. If it's not, she let it sit unfinished. 6 days was a workable window. Nathan had operated in tighter ones. What made this one different was the variable he couldn't control. Whoever was managing the inside track, whoever had the legitimate access and the daily presence and the patience to spend weeks adjusting camera angles. That person was still here, still operational, and did not yet know how much Nathan had seen. Dr. Ito, Nathan said. How well do you know him? She looked at him sharply. Kenji's been with me since year 2. I'm not making an accusation. I'm asking how well you know him. A pause. I trust him. Who else has access to the batch records for MBX7? The synthesis team. 4 researchers. Marcus, my assistant, has administrative access to the data systems, but not the lab itself. She was working through it now, and he could see her doing it. The same focused audit he'd been running, applied to people instead of physical spaces. Gerald Sutton, the board chair, has a security clearance that gives him read access to approved research summaries, not raw data. Who manages the building security system? Not the guards. The administration. The access logs, the badge issuance. That's under our head of facilities operations, a man named Carl Bren. She said the name and then went quiet, and he saw her file something. What? He asked. Carl Bren joined us 14 months ago, she said slowly. He came from a facilities management company, Crestline Services. The name landed in the room between them like a thing with mass. Crestline, Nathan said. Yes. She looked at him. That's the same company that contracted Ferris. The problem with knowing the shape of a conspiracy was that it changed what you could do about it. Nathan had operated plenty of times in environments where the correct response to knowing the shape of something was to immediately disrupt it, remove the critical node, collapse the structure. But those environments had come with authority and tools and teams, and this was none of those things. This was a building he worked in as a janitor, which meant that if he walked into the security office and confronted Carl Bren with what he knew, the most likely outcome was that Bren would deny everything. Nathan would be terminated for creating a hostile work environment, and whoever was managing Bren from outside would simply accelerate the timeline and go to contingencies. He needed evidence that existed outside his notebook, physical, documented, transferable evidence. The server room, he said to Claire, the backup data system. If Ferris is introducing corrupted data, it'll be in the most recent backup files, and it'll be designed to look like a recording error rather than a deliberate change. Your IT team won't catch it unless they know to look for a specific kind of manipulation. What kind? Parametric drift. Small systematic variations in the batch stability data. Small enough to be within normal recording variance, but consistent enough that when you run them forward against the formulation model, they produce a degradation outcome. He paused. It would look like the compound has a shelf life problem you hadn't detected, a problem serious enough to require additional testing before regulatory submission. She stared at him. You know pharmaceutical data manipulation. I know how people sabotage systems, he said. The specifics change. The architecture doesn't. She thought for a moment. Then, if I pull the backup files myself and run a parametric comparison, I can document any systematic variation, but I'd need to do it without Bren knowing I've accessed the server room. I can get you in, Nathan said. The server room is on my cleaning route. I have a logged reason to be there with my cart. You come in as someone checking on a maintenance issue in the adjacent corridor, she said, already building it. Marcus can schedule a fictitious facilities inspection that runs through my calendar. It would explain my presence in that area at an odd hour. Make it for tomorrow night, Nathan said, before Bren's next opportunity to cover his tracks. She nodded. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, in the way she'd been not quite doing since the parking garage. The way of someone who has been carefully not asking a question and has decided to ask it. Why are you doing this, she said. Not the Navy explanation. Not I pay attention. Why are you here, in this building, doing this specific job, and why are you doing what you're doing right now? He looked at her for a long moment. Liam's been on the neurologist's radar for 2 years, he said. Last March, Dr. Huang, his doctor, mentioned a Meridian trial. Said the compound looked promising, but the approval timeline was uncertain and the waiting list was long. He said it simply, without inflection, the way he said things he'd already processed and filed. I looked you up. I found that the company was real, and the compound was real, and you were the person who made both of them. Then I looked at your security infrastructure, and I saw a building that someone who knew what they were doing could walk right through. So I applied for the maintenance position. She was very still. You took this job to protect me, she said, so the drug stays on track. So Liam gets a chance at the trial. I took this job because my son needed someone to make sure the thing that could help him actually made it to where it needed to go, he said. Protecting you is the mechanism. It's not complicated. She looked at him for a long time after that, and he let her look because it was the truth, and there was nothing in the truth that needed to be managed or softened. It was what it was. Nathan, she said finally, I want you to know something. She paused, choosing the words carefully. If MBX7 gets approved, when it gets approved, Liam will have access to the trial. I'll make sure of it personally, not because of what you've done here, because it's what the drug is for. He nodded. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. Uptat. Dr. Ido's findings arrived in Claire's encrypted personal email at 6:40 the following morning, and they were worse than she'd anticipated. The parametric drift Nathan had described was there, exactly as he'd outlined it. A systematic variation in 7 of the last 12 batch stability records, small enough that the automated quality control system had flagged nothing, consistent enough that when Dr. Ito ran them forward through the formulation model, the projected outcome showed a degradation onset at 14 weeks that would require a full reformulation review before regulatory submission could proceed. The review process would take 60 days minimum. The board meeting was in 6 days. Dr. Ito had written at the bottom of his report, in the careful, measured prose of a scientist who understood the weight of what he was documenting. The variations are too consistent to be recording error. They follow a pattern. Someone introduced them deliberately. Claire forwarded the report to a secure cloud folder she'd created the previous night on a personal account with no connection to Meridian's systems. Then she made a call to a number she'd stored in her personal phone 3 years ago and never used. A contact, a friend of a friend, had passed along in a conversation about corporate espionage liability, the kind of contact you kept because you hoped you'd never need it. A federal investigator who specialized in pharmaceutical industry fraud. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it was done, she sat for a moment in the still apartment with the phone in her hand, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion. Not fear exactly, but the particular gravity of a decision that couldn't be walked back. There was a certain clarity to it. She had spent 3 years fighting for MBX7 through legitimate channels, through peer review and trial protocols and board politics, and the grinding institutional machinery of pharmaceutical approval, and she had always understood abstractly that there were forces that would prefer the drug not succeed. She had not understood, until 4 days ago, that those forces were operational inside her building. She called Nathan's cell. She'd gotten the number from HR records, using the same administrative access that Marcus could have flagged if he'd been watching her activity, which was a thought she noted and set aside for later. Nathan answered on the second ring, which was how he answered everything. "Ito confirmed it," she said. 7 contaminated batch records. "I've contacted a federal investigator." A beat. "How soon can they move?" he asked. "They need to build the case before they act. A week, maybe less, if I can get them the server access records." She paused. "There's something else. The investigator said this pattern, the contractor access, the internal facilitator, the data manipulation timed to a regulatory deadline. He said he'd seen a version of it twice in the past 3 years. Both times, the pharmaceutical company involved was being pressured by a specific type of external interest. Not a competitor exactly, more like an investment entity that profits from the delay." "A syndicate," Nathan said. She paused. "Yes, he used that word." "Then we're not just dealing with someone trying to protect market share," Nathan said. "We're dealing with people who do this professionally, who've done it before, which means they already have contingencies, and when the contractor path gets shut down, they'll escalate." She understood what he wasn't saying. "They'll stop trying to delay the drug," she said. "They'll try to stop me." "Yes," he said. 6 days is a long time." Outside her apartment window, the city was running through its morning rhythms, enormous and indifferent as always. She looked at it for a moment. Then she got up, put the phone in her pocket, and began getting ready for a day she needed to survive cleanly. "I'll be in the building by 9, she said. "Come find me before noon." "I'll be there," Nathan said, and she believed him absolutely, which was not a feeling she associated with many people, and which sat in her chest with a weight she didn't have time to examine. She put the phone down, picked up her keys, looked at the lock on her apartment door. A standard residential deadbolt, the kind that an experienced man with the right tools could open in under 40 seconds. She added a chain lock before she left. It was a small thing. It wasn't enough. But it was what she had available, and she had learned, was still learning, that you worked with what was available, and you didn't wait for things to be enough before you started. That was, she was beginning to understand, something she and Nathan Wolfe had always had in common, long before the parking garage, long before any of this. She locked the door behind her and went out into the morning. The federal investigator's name was Sandra Voss, and she had asked for 72 hours. Claire had given her the server access records, Dr. Ido's parametric analysis, the contractor badge logs, and a detailed written account of everything Nathan had observed and documented over the preceding weeks. Formatted carefully, stripped of anything that would raise questions about how a maintenance worker had come to possess such precise operational awareness of a corporate espionage campaign. Voss had listened through the entire briefing with the stillness of someone who had trained herself not to react to new information, and at the end she had said 2 things. First, that what Claire had brought her was more than enough to open a formal investigation. Second, that opening a formal investigation would trigger mandatory notification protocols that the target network would likely detect within 48 hours through their inside contact. "Carl Bren," Claire had said. "Or someone above Bren," Voss had replied. "The inside facilitator in operations like this one is rarely the top of the internal chain. They're the access point. Someone else is managing them." That conversation had taken place 3 days ago, which meant Voss's 72 hours had expired at 6 that morning, and it was now past 8, and Claire had not heard back. She was sitting in her office running the revised formulation models. The clean ones. The ones Dr. Ito had reconstructed from original pre-corruption source data. When Marcus knocked and opened the door without waiting, which he never did, his face had the particular expression of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. "Gerald Sutton just called the main line," Marcus said. "He's convening an emergency board session. Tonight, 7 p.m. Claire set down her coffee. "On what grounds?" "He cited the security incident last week," and Marcus hesitated. "He cited concerns about data integrity in the MBX7 regulatory submission. He says 2 board members have requested an independent audit of the trial data before the submission proceeds." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Someone told him about the batch record contamination," Claire said. It wasn't a question. The official investigation hasn't been announced, Marcus said carefully. I don't know how he… Bren, she said. Carl Bren told him. She stood up. Get me Voss's direct line. Not the office number, the cell number she gave me at the end of the meeting. Marcus left. Claire stood at her window and did the math that she'd been trying not to do for the past 3 days. The board meeting was the mechanism. It didn't need to destroy the drug. It just needed to create enough institutional disruption to justify bringing in outside management, which would then restructure the company's charter protections around MBX7's pricing model, which would take months, during which the compound would sit in regulatory limbo, during which the 3 competing compounds held by the institutional investor would consolidate their market position. It was, she thought, almost elegant in its indirectness. You didn't have to kill the drug. You just had to kill the company's ability to protect it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. Need to see you. Now. Not the office. Supply corridor B3. The supply corridor on subfloor 3 was the longest unmonitored stretch in the building. Nathan had mapped it in his first month, noted it, and filed the information in the same mental architecture where he kept everything that might eventually be useful. It smelled like industrial detergent and concrete, and the lighting was the kind that buzzed faintly at a frequency just below conscious irritation. He was waiting beside his cart when Claire came through the fire door, and he could tell from the way she moved that something had changed in the last hour. Sutton called an emergency board session, she said. I know. He had a look she hadn't seen before, not the controlled watchfulness of the past week, something tighter, the kind of stillness that precedes movement rather than accompanies patience. I found something this morning, early, before my shift officially starts. He handed her his phone. On the screen was a photograph, taken in low light, slightly blurred at the edges, but clear enough at the center, of 2 men in the freight elevator. One was Ferris, the contractor. The other was a man she didn't recognize. Mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, a face that was not memorable in any particular way, which was, she was learning, its own kind of memorable. I don't know him, she said. I ran the plate on the vehicle he arrived in, Nathan said. I was outside this morning at 5:30 for… He paused, in the way he paused when he was deciding how much of a thing to explain. Other reasons. The vehicle is registered to a logistics company called Hartwell Group. Hartwell Group shares a registered agent with 3 other entities, including a pharmaceutical investment fund called Orion Capital Partners. She looked up from the phone. Orion. You know it. Orion Capital has a position in 2 compounds that directly compete with MBX7, she said. I've known about them for 2 years. They made an informal acquisition inquiry through an intermediary 18 months ago. I turned it down. She handed the phone back. They're the institutional shareholder that's aligned with Sutton's board majority. They're also the people who hired the men in your parking garage, Nathan said. This man, he tapped the photograph. He's the operational manager. He's not here for data. He's here to verify that the board meeting tonight goes correctly and that if it doesn't, there's a contingency in place. She held very still. What kind of contingency? The kind that doesn't involve waiting for a board vote, he said. The fluorescent light buzzed above them. Somewhere in the building's infrastructure, a pump cycled on and ran for 30 seconds and cycled off. Boss needs more time, Claire said. If she moves before she has the full chain documented, she may not get to choose her timing, Nathan said. Tonight, the board meeting either neutralizes you through institutional process or it doesn't. If it doesn't, the man in that photograph has a different set of instructions. He looked at her directly. I need you to do something that's going to be uncomfortable. Most things worth doing are. I need you to not be where you're supposed to be tonight. Cancel the board meeting. Cite a medical issue, a security concern. The reason doesn't matter. I need them uncertain about your location for the next 12 hours while Voss finalizes. She shook her head. If I cancel, Sutton uses it as grounds for the vote in absentia. He has the bylaw mechanism. I've seen it. The board can act without me present if they determine I'm unavailable for reasons outside operational necessity. Then don't cancel, Nathan said. Change the venue. Move the meeting to somewhere they haven't prepared for, a location that's not this building. She thought about that. My attorney's firm. They have a secure conference room in the Aldridge Tower. I have building access through the partnership agreement. I can call a venue change on security grounds, and it falls within my CEO authority to relocate board meetings in response to active security incidents. She paused. The parking garage attack gives me legitimate grounds. Do it, he said, and text Voss the new location. Tell her to have people outside the building by 6. She looked at him. You think it's going to happen tonight? I think Orion Capital didn't spend 18 months building an inside track in your company to lose it in a board meeting, he said. And I think the man in that photograph didn't drive here at 5 in the morning for the atmosphere. She made 3 calls in the elevator on the way back to her office. The first to her attorney to secure the conference room. The second to Marcus to notify the board members of the venue change. The third to Voss, which went to voicemail and to which she spoke quickly and quietly, and then hung up, feeling the particular unease of having said something important into silence. Nathan watched her go, then turned back to his cart and started pushing it toward the south corridor because he had floors to clean and a building to keep watching. And those two things had become the same thing, so gradually he'd stopped being able to distinguish between them. He was at the end of the corridor, turning toward the elevator bank, when his phone vibrated. Not a call. A notification from the monitoring app he'd installed on the tablet he left at his apartment. A basic motion-triggered system he'd set up in Liam's room, something he'd put in when the tremors first started getting worse. And the neurologist had said the word seizure as a possibility, and Nathan had responded by doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was create a monitoring system and check it compulsively. The notification should have been nothing. It was usually nothing. The tablet triggered when Liam rolled over in bed, or when the morning light shifted, or when the neighbor's cat somehow got onto the fire escape and pressed its face against the window, which had happened twice and which Liam had found delightful. Nathan looked at the notification. The image on his phone screen stopped his blood cold. It was not Liam rolling over in bed. It was a man standing in the hallway outside Liam's bedroom door. He called his mother first because she had a key and she was 12 minutes away, and because whatever he said to her she would not panic and would not hesitate, which were the two things he needed from her right now above everything else. "There's someone in the apartment," he said when she answered. "Don't go inside. Take Liam out through Mrs. Kowalski downstairs. She has a key for emergencies. Liam knows her. Tell him it's a fire drill. Go to the coffee shop on Mercer. Stay there. Call me when you're there." Nathan. "Mom." His voice was very quiet and very flat. "Please." A pause. She'd heard that voice before, from a distance, on rare phone calls from places he hadn't been able to name. She understood what the voice meant. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I'm going." He hung up and stood still for 3 seconds in the empty corridor, 3 seconds of complete physical stillness, while something happened inside him that wasn't visible from the outside but was, functionally, a wall coming down. He had spent 6 years building a life that kept those walls standing because Liam needed a father, not a weapon. And he had been very careful about that distinction, had maintained it through things that had tested it badly, and now someone had put a man outside his son's bedroom door, and the distinction was no longer available to him. He pulled the cart to the wall, blocked the wheels, left it there, and went to find the man from the photograph. He found him on subfloor 1, in the narrow access corridor that ran behind the building's main mechanical room, a space that appeared on no official building schematic because it had been part of an early-stage construction modification that the building's original developer had handled off the books. Nathan knew about it because he had spent 6 years learning every space in this building that the official documentation didn't acknowledge. The man from the photograph was not alone. He had 2 men with him, both younger, both carrying themselves with the specific compacted quality of trained personnel. They were standing over a case, not the biological transport case from the freight elevator, something different, something flat and hard-sided. And one of the younger men was removing items from it with the practiced economy of someone who knew exactly what each item was for. Nathan came in from the south access point and he came in fast, which was the only way to do it when the numbers were 3-1, and the alternative was waiting for them to finish what they were doing. The first man was the one crouched over the case, which meant he was off balance and partially committed to what was in front of him rather than what was behind. Nathan cleared that problem in 2 seconds. The second man was faster, military trained, no question about it, with the response time of someone who'd been in rooms that went wrong before. And for a few seconds it was genuinely difficult, the kind of difficult that left marks. and Nathan took a hit across the cheekbone that he felt down through his back teeth. He put the second man down anyway. It was messier than the parking garage, and it hurt, and neither of those things mattered. The man from the photograph had backed against the wall during the 10 seconds it had taken to clear his two colleagues, and he was looking at Nathan now with an expression that had moved through surprise and arrived somewhere more calculating. He was older. He was smart. I was the kind of man who understood that the situation had shifted and was running options. Orion Capital, Nathan said. He was breathing hard, which he couldn't fully help, and his cheekbone was doing something complicated, which he also couldn't help. The man who runs your operations decisions. I need a name. The man looked at him. You're the janitor. I'm the janitor, Nathan agreed. You took down Tresser's team in the parking garage. He said it with the flat professional respect of someone assessing a threat level. I read the report. 4 men. I need a name, Nathan said again. You're going to have a problem, the man said. He was buying time. Buying it as a professional, which meant he believed he could afford to. This building is going to be very busy in about 40 minutes, and you're not positioned to... Nathan moved. Not toward the man, past him, to the case that was still open on the floor. He looked at what was inside. He looked at it for 2 seconds, then stood back up. Incendiary components, he said. You were going to burn the lab. He looked at the man from the photograph. Not kill anyone, burn the lab. Destroy the synthesis data on the primary system, so the backup, the corrupted backup, is the only thing left. The man said nothing, which was its own answer. You already have people moving on the backup server, Nathan said. Right now, while I'm down here. He felt the shape of it assemble, the board meeting as misdirection, the fire in the lab as the real mechanism, the corrupted backup as the finishing stroke. Even if Claire's emergency venue change disrupted the board meeting, the physical destruction of the primary lab and research data would trigger a mandatory regulatory halt, regardless of what any board voted. Smart, Nathan said, and he meant it. Who runs it? I want a lawyer. You're in a subfloor access corridor with incendiary materials, Nathan said. You'll get a lawyer. First give me what I need. A beat. The man's eyes moved to his 2 colleagues on the floor, did the math, came back to Nathan. Hargrove, he said finally. Director of that name is all I have. Nathan looked at him for a moment, then took out his phone and called Voss directly. She answered this time, on the first ring. Subfloor 1, South Mechanical Access, he said. I have 3 individuals, 1 conscious, and an incendiary kit. They were going to burn Lab C and the primary synthesis systems tonight. They have people moving on the backup server right now. You need to move on the building's data center immediately. He paused. And I need you to contact Detective Rosario at the City PD and tell him there are unauthorized individuals in an apartment at... He gave the address. The child in that apartment needs to be confirmed safe. Voss was quiet for exactly 1 second. Are you law enforcement? No. How are you? She stopped. Made the decision he could hear her making. 17 minutes, she said. Keep them there. He hung up and looked at the man from the photograph, who was looking back at him with the expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation substantially downward. 17 minutes, Nathan said. Sit down. His mother called it the 11-minute mark. They were at the coffee shop on Mercer. Liam was eating a chocolate croissant and had asked no questions beyond whether he could get a hot chocolate, which had been granted. The fire drill explanation had held because Liam was 8 and trusted his grandmother and also was currently absorbed in the croissant. Is it okay? His mother asked quietly, so Liam wouldn't hear. It will be, Nathan said. He was still in the subfloor corridor, sitting on an equipment crate 6 feet from the man who'd sent someone to stand outside his son's bedroom door, and his cheekbone was swelling up into something that was going to look terrible tomorrow, and his hands were shaking slightly in a way they sometimes did after the adrenaline burned down, which was not something he'd ever fully been able to stop. Nathan. His mother's voice was the voice she used when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a long time. I need you to tell me you're okay. I'm okay, he said. Tell me the truth. He thought about the case on the floor. He thought about Liam eating a chocolate croissant. He thought about the formulation models on Claire's computer and the 6 years he'd spent pushing a cart with a bad wheel through corridors that nobody else paid attention to, and the particular loneliness of that, and the particular necessity of it, and the fact that tonight those two things had finally met each other at a point where one of them had to give way. "I'm okay," he said again. "I just need you to stay with him until I come." "We're not going anywhere," she said. He put the phone in his pocket. Across the corridor, the man from the photograph was watching him with the particular attention of a professional who was reassessing everything he thought he knew about what kind of problem Nathan Wolfe represented. Nathan looked back at him without expression. The building above them was very quiet, and then it wasn't. He could hear the ventilation system shift, which was the building's version of holding its breath before something happened, and then the sound of multiple elevator cars moving simultaneously, which was not normal at this hour. Voss was early. She came in with 4 agents and 2 city PD officers, which was more than Nathan had expected, and which told him she'd had more of the case assembled than she'd let on in their phone calls. She was in her mid-40s, shorter than he'd pictured from her voice, with the specific kind of organized efficiency that made people around her move faster without quite understanding why. She looked at the 3 men on the floor, at the case of incendiary materials, at Nathan sitting on the equipment crate with a rapidly purpling cheekbone, and then she looked at the notebook he'd placed on top of the case. The composition notebook. 6 weeks of observations, dates, badge numbers, access log entries, the Crestline connection, all of it, and she picked it up and paged through 3 pages before looking back at him. "You're not law enforcement," she said. "No." "Military?" "Previously." She looked at the notebook again. "This is 6 weeks of intelligence documentation." "It's a cleaning log," he said, "with observations." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone deciding whether a distinction matters. "The backup server team," she said. "We have them. 2 individuals in the data center caught mid-process. The parametric corruption Dr. Ito identified is documented and preserved as evidence." She paused. "The board meeting has been postponed pending the investigation. Mr. Sutton is currently being interviewed regarding his relationship with Orion Capital Partners." The name Hargrove, Nathan noted, she did not mention, which meant either the name hadn't reached her yet, or she already knew it, and it meant something she wasn't saying in this corridor. He made note of the omission the way he made note of everything and let it sit. "The name from the photograph," Nathan said. "Hargrove. The man you have in front of you said it was a director-level name. That's all he gave me." Voss looked at him steadily. "I'm aware of that name," she said. "We've been aware of it for longer than this investigation." She didn't say more than that, and he didn't push because it told him enough. This was not a thread that started with Meridian. This was a thread that had been running before Meridian, and Meridian had simply been where it surfaced into visibility. He stood up from the equipment crate because sitting was starting to make his ribs aware of the second man's elbow, which had connected with more force than he'd fully registered in the moment. He picked up his phone and checked the time. "I need to go get my son," he said. Voss looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not softness exactly, but the acknowledgement of a dimension of the situation that her training didn't give her a clean category for. "We'll need a full statement," she said. "I know. I'll come in tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "The apartment at the address I gave you." "Confirmed clear," she said. "No one was inside when the officers arrived. Entry had been made. The lock showed recent force. But whoever was sent there left when they couldn't locate the child." She paused. "Your son is safe." He nodded. The nod was the same controlled thing he did with most information, but something underneath it was not controlled, was not quite manageable. Was the thing that happened in his chest when he thought about an 8-year-old boy sitting in a coffee shop with a chocolate croissant, not knowing that the world he lived in had just come very close to something terrible. He walked to the freight elevator, pressed the button. Waited for the doors to open the way he had waited for things every night for 6 years in this building. Steady, quiet, not asking for anything the moment wasn't ready to give. The doors opened. He got in. Claire found out what had happened in the subfloor corridor approximately 40 minutes after it had already finished, via a call from Voss that was brief and procedural and ended with Voss saying, in a tone that suggested she was choosing her words carefully, that a Meridian employee had provided material assistance in securing the scene and the evidence. "Which employee?" Claire had asked. Voss had paused. "A Mr. Nathan Wolfe. Maintenance." She'd sat very still in the Aldridge Tower conference room where the board meeting had been postponed mid-agenda, with Gerald Sutton looking pale at the far end of the table and three board members scrolling their phones, and the particular suspended quality of a room where everyone understands that the landscape has just shifted, but nobody has the full map yet. She'd thought about Nathan alone in a subfloor corridor with three men. She'd thought about the composition notebook with 6 weeks of careful, precise observations. She'd thought about a man who had taken a maintenance job in a building where he didn't belong because his 8-year-old son needed the drug that the building was protecting, and who had spent 6 months invisible and watchful and alone in that particular way that people who have learned to need very little from other people are alone. She'd thought about Liam, whom she had never met, whose name she now carried the way you carry names that matter. "Is he all right?" she asked Voss. Another pause. "He has an injury to his face that should be looked at," Voss said. "He declined medical attention on scene." Of course he did, she'd thought. She'd ended the call and looked across the conference room at Gerald Sutton, who met her eyes with the expression of a man who understood that the chess game he'd been playing had just ended, and the ending had not been his. "I'd like to propose," Claire said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "that we table the agenda items related to the MBX-7 regulatory submission until the federal investigation has concluded." She paused. "Given the circumstances, I believe the board will find that position both legally prudent and ethically necessary." Gerald Sutton said nothing. Nobody said anything. The meeting ended 17 minutes later. It was past midnight when Nathan got back to his apartment. Liam was asleep on his grandmother's couch, curled around a throw pillow with the specific boneless quality of children. Sleeping deeply, one arm hanging loose off the cushion, the gap-toothed mouth slightly open. His grandmother was in the kitchen, and she looked at Nathan's face when he came in and put her hand briefly on his cheek, the undamaged one, with the wordless weight of a woman who had been terrified for the better part of 7 hours and was choosing to express it as a touch rather than the many other things she could have expressed it as. "He's fine," Nathan said quietly. "I know he's fine," she said. "I can see he's fine." She took her hand away. "What about you?" He looked at his son sleeping on the couch. The left hand, hanging off the cushion, was still. No tremor. Just a sleeping kid, 8 years old, who had eaten a chocolate croissant and asked no questions and gone to sleep on a couch because the world around him had arranged itself into a shape he couldn't see, held in place by hands he didn't know were there. "I'm okay," Nathan said. He pulled the throw blanket up over Liam's shoulder. He sat down in the chair beside the couch and put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not in grief, not in breakdown, just in the way of a man who needed 30 seconds of not being seen by anyone, even himself. His cheekbone hurt. His ribs hurt. The knuckles on his right hand had opened up again, the same scar site as the parking garage. And he thought distantly that the thing about old wounds was that they knew exactly where to find you. He took his hands away from his face. Across the room, his son breathed in and breathed out with the slow rhythm of someone who didn't know how close things had come. And Nathan watched that breathing for a long time in the dark, the way he had watched Liam sleep since the very beginning, since the apartment in Virginia where none of this had started yet, and everything that would become this had already been set in motion. The tremor in Liam's hand was still. For now, that was enough. Nathan gave his statement to Sandra Voss the following morning at 7:45, sitting across from her in a federal field office interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, with his right hand wrapped in clean bandaging his mother had insisted on before he left the apartment, and a bruise across his cheekbone that had developed overnight into something spectacular in its ugliness. Voss had a legal pad and a recorder, and the focused patience of someone who understood that the person across from her was going to say exactly what they chose to say, and not one word more, so the quality of her questions mattered more than their quantity. She was good at her questions. She took him through the 6 weeks of the composition notebook systematically, cross-referencing his observations against the documentary evidence her team had pulled from the building's physical logs and the server room. The parametric corruption in the MBX-7 batch records, she confirmed, had been introduced across 4 separate intrusion events, 3 in the backup server, 1 directly in the primary lab data system through a terminal that Carl Bren had accessed using a senior researcher's borrowed credentials. The researcher in question, a woman named Dr. Alvarez on the synthesis team, had not been aware her credentials were being used. Bren had acquired her access card during a routine facilities inspection of the lab 3 months earlier, copied the card's data, and returned it within 4 minutes. Dr. Alvarez had noticed nothing. He was thorough, Nathan said. He was, Voss agreed. She said it without admiration, just as an assessment. He's been in custody since 11 last night. He's cooperating. She turned a page on her legal pad. The name you extracted in the subfloor, Hargrove. Richard Hargrove. He's the operations director for the North American division of a holding structure that Orion Capital Partners uses to manage what they call competitive realignment. That's the language in their internal documentation. She said the phrase with the particular flatness of someone who has seen enough euphemism to be permanently finished with it. They've done this before. We've had a file on the structure for 14 months. Meridian was the fourth company they'd moved on. The first three didn't have, she paused, chose the word, adequate internal awareness. Nathan looked at her. Adequate internal awareness. Someone who noticed, she said, and had the skill set to do something about what they noticed. He let that sit without responding to it. Hargrove is talking, Voss continued. The two men you left in the subfloor corridor are talking. The backup server team is talking. She set her pen down in a way that signaled a transition. The upper structure of Orion's realignment operation is going to take time to fully document and prosecute, but the immediate threat to Meridian Biosciences and to Dr. Bennett personally has been neutralized. Hargrove mentioned there were contingencies, Nathan said, beyond what was deployed last night. We're aware of them, Voss said. We're moving on those now. She looked at him steadily. Are you aware of anything specific that you haven't already documented in the notebook? No? She nodded, picked up her pen. I want to ask you something off the record. All right. The apartment. Your son. You called that in while you were actively managing a 3-on-1 situation in a subfloor corridor. She said it without the upward inflection of a question, which was its own kind of question. Nathan looked at the table for a moment. He's 8, he said. The situation in the corridor was manageable. His situation wasn't something I could manage from a distance. He looked up. The call took 11 seconds. Voss looked at him for a beat. The officers who responded to the apartment, they noted forced entry. Someone had been sent there deliberately. As leverage, we think, either to threaten or to detain in case the primary operation faced complications. She paused. The individual sent to your apartment left before the officers arrived. We don't have them in custody. Nathan had known this from the report Voss's team had sent over that morning. He had known it, and he had made himself sit with it, because the alternative, the shape of what he wanted to do about a person who had been sent to stand outside his son's bedroom, was not a shape that had any useful function in the current situation. I understand, he said. If you encounter anything that suggests ongoing surveillance of your residence or your son, I'll contact you immediately, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, in the way she had of looking at things she was assessing rather than judging. The notebook, she said, it goes into evidence, but I'd like to return it when the case closes. Keep it, Nathan said. I don't need it anymore. I was back at the apartment by 10. His mother had taken Liam to school, which was the right call. Routine was the scaffolding that kept an 8-year-old's world stable, and Liam didn't know enough about the previous night to need scaffolding from a disrupted source. Nathan had explained the apartment situation to his son as a gas leak precaution that had been resolved, which was close enough to a version of the truth that it didn't feel like a full lie. And Liam had accepted this with the practical curiosity he brought to most things, and moved on to asking whether they could get a dog. Nathan had not answered the dog question. He sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook's replacement, a blank one, from the same brand, which he'd bought at a drugstore on the way home from the Federal Building. And he opened it to the first page and sat there for a while, not writing anything. The habit of documentation was so deeply embedded that he'd bought the notebook automatically, but now that it was open in front of him, he wasn't sure what to put in it. For 6 years, the notebook had been a tool with a specific operational purpose. That purpose was now discharged. What remained was a version of his life that was, for the first time in longer than he could track, not organized around a threat. He wasn't sure, practically, what that looked like. He closed the notebook, made coffee, looked out the apartment window at the street below where a woman was arguing with a delivery driver about a package, and 2 kids were on scooters on the sidewalk, and an old man was reading a newspaper on a bench with the patient engagement of someone who had nowhere to be and had decided that was fine. His phone rang. Claire. He answered. "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "My attorney spent most of the night on calls with the federal team. The board formally suspended Gerald Sutton's committee memberships pending the investigation." A pause. "He hasn't said much. His lawyer released a statement this morning saying he was unaware of the full nature of Orion's activities." "Do you believe that?" "I think he knew enough to look away from things he should have looked at," she said. "Whether that rises to criminal complicity is someone else's question now." She sounded like she'd been up since the Aldridge Tower meeting the previous night, which she probably had. Her voice had the specific texture of someone running on determination and insufficient sleep, flat in some places, sharper than usual in others. "Nathan, I need to ask you something." "Okay." "The batch records. The corruption in the backup data." A pause, longer than usual. "Kenji ran the clean reconstruction last night. He worked through until 4 a.m. The primary formulation data is intact. The corruption was in the stability projections, not the core synthesis parameters, which means—" She stopped, and he could hear her choosing the next words carefully. "Which means MBX7 is where we thought it was. The drug is real. The data is real. The regulatory submission is still viable." He was quiet for a moment. Something settled in his chest. Not surprised, because he'd understood the distinction between the corrupted and the intact data from what Ito's report had described, but something that was the confirmation of a thing he'd been holding at a particular careful distance for 4 months, landing close enough to actually feel. "Good," he said. The word came out flatter than he intended it to, flatter than the thing it was standing in for. "Liam," Claire said. It was just the name, no attached sentence. The name by itself is a question. "He's at school," Nathan said. "He doesn't know anything happened." "How is he medically? How is he doing?" "The tremors have gotten slightly worse over the past 3 weeks," Nathan said. He said it the way he'd learned to say the clinical things, without the weight he actually felt about them, because the weight didn't help anyone, and the facts were what needed to be communicated. His neurologist, Dr. Huang, has him on a modified protocol that's slowing the progression, but the current medication is approaching the ceiling of what it can do. The ataxia is affecting his fine motor control more than it was 6 months ago. "I know," Claire said quietly. "I pulled his case summary from the trial waitlist. I know what it says." She paused. "I want to accelerate his access to the trial protocol. Not as a favor. Not because of what you've done. I want to be clear about that. Because he meets every inclusion criterion, and his progression timeline makes him a priority candidate. Kenji agrees. Dr. Huang's referral note is already in the trial system." Nathan held the phone and said nothing for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "Claire," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I mean that. The drug is what it is. Liam is who he is. Those two things meeting each other isn't a transaction. It's just—" She paused. "It's what should have always been able to happen without 6 months of you fighting through walls in a maintenance uniform to make it possible." He looked at the blank notebook on the table, at the window where the street was doing its ordinary Tuesday things, at the chair across from him where Liam ate breakfast every morning with his comic books and his opinions about soggy cereal. "Okay," he said. "I'd also like to meet him," she said. "If that's when you think it's appropriate. I don't want to show up in his life as a complication. I know it's not a simple thing." "It's not," he agreed, "but it's not impossible either." A pause that had a different quality than the previous ones. Not loaded with information, just with the particular adjustment of two people recalibrating a relationship that had been operating under emergency conditions for long enough that neither of them had thought carefully about what it looked like when the emergency stopped. "Get some sleep," Nathan said. "That's the plan," she said. "After the submission documents are refiled, which Marcus is handling, but I need to sign." "Claire." "I'm fine." "You've been awake for at least 30 hours. 32, she said. "But who's counting?" A pause, and under the exhaustion something that was almost like humor. "You are, obviously." He almost said something. He stopped. "Get some sleep after the filing," he said, and hung up. The federal investigation moved quickly once it had the full shape of the network. Voss had been right that the upper structure would take time, but the operational layer, Hargrove, the contractor network, the 2 men from the backup server, The individual who had been sent to Nathan's apartment and who was located and taken into custody 36 hours later in a motel 3 miles from the Meridian building. That layer collapsed inside a week. 11 arrests, 7 in federal custody, 4 cooperating under negotiated agreements that Voss described in her updates to Claire, with the efficient neutrality of a professional who understood that the mechanism of prosecution was not the same thing as justice, but was the closest available approximation. Carl Brenn pleaded guilty in the first week of negotiations, which surprised no one. He was 39 years old, had a wife and 2 kids in the suburbs, and had taken Orion's approach money 14 months earlier when his previous employer had faced financial difficulties and Crestline Services had appeared with a job offer and a separate arrangement that paid twice his salary. He had told himself, in the way that people in arrangements like his tell themselves things, that he was managing an information flow, not facilitating harm. The incendiary kit in the subfloor, he said through his attorney, had not been part of his understanding of the operation. Voss's team did not find that distinction legally significant. Neither did the federal prosecutor. Gerald Sutton resigned from the Meridian board 9 days after the Aldridge Tower meeting, citing health reasons in a statement that his communications team had clearly spent considerable time on. The board elected an interim chair, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had been on the board for 2 years, and had been, Claire noted to Nathan in a text she sent at 11 at night with the brevity of someone who'd had a long day, consistently the person who asked the questions everyone else wanted to ignore. The regulatory submission was refiled clean, on time, supported by Dr. Ito's reconstructed and fully documented stability data, with an additional independent verification from a contracted bioanalytical lab that Claire had brought in specifically to preempt any challenge to the data integrity. The submission went in on a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus brought a bottle of sparkling water to the office and poured it into paper cups, which was Claire's version of a celebration, which Nathan learned about secondhand from Marcus, who told him with the expression of someone who found their employer's restraint both admirable and slightly bewildering. Dr. Huang called Nathan on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the subfloor corridor, at a time Nathan had come to associate with medical calls. Early enough to be business. Early enough that the day hadn't yet accumulated around whatever the call was going to add to it. Liam's been approved for the MBX7 trial, Huang said. He said it with the careful warmth of a doctor who understood that his patient's parents had learned to be cautious about good news, who had learned to hold it at a slight distance until it proved itself. We'd want to start the initial dosing protocol in 2 weeks, assuming the standard pre-trial screenings come back normal. Nathan sat down at the kitchen table. The blank notebook was still there. He'd never written anything in it. 2 weeks, he said. The protocol is an 8-week initial cycle, Huang continued. We'll be monitoring his cerebellar markers weekly. If the trial data holds, and I want to be clear that we're still in controlled trial, there are no guarantees. But if it holds, we'd expect to see measurable stabilization in the degradation progression within the first 6 to 8 weeks. Nathan looked at the notebook. He looked at the 2 cereal bowls in the drying rack from this morning's breakfast, one of which had a small chip in the rim that Liam had caused by dropping it, and which they'd kept anyway because Liam had felt terrible about the chip, and Nathan had said chips in bowls were fine, bowls didn't have to be perfect to work. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Huang said, in a tone that echoed something Nathan had heard before without being able to place it immediately. He's a good kid. He deserves this. He told Liam that night after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the TV off, which Liam registered immediately as a signal that something important was happening. Liam had the radar of a child who had learned to pay attention to the adult world for signs of information being withheld, which was a thing Nathan felt responsible for and had no clean way to undo. Is something bad happening? Liam asked. His dark eyes were very direct, looking across the table with the expression he got when he was preparing himself. No, Nathan said. Something good. Liam considered this with appropriate skepticism. Usually when you say something good, there's a complicated part first. There's not a complicated part this time, Nathan said. Dr. Huang called today. There's a new treatment. We talked about treatments before, remember? We talked about the research and the trial. The medicine that might help, Liam said carefully. Yeah, Nathan paused. It's ready. You can start it in 2 weeks. Liam was quiet. He looked at the table for a moment, then looked up. Will it fix the shaking? We don't know yet for sure. Dr. Huang thinks it has a very good chance of slowing it down a lot. Maybe stopping it. He met his son's eyes. We have to go through the treatment first and see what it does. I can't promise you an outcome, Liam. I can tell you the doctor thinks it's the best chance you've had. Okay, Liam said. Okay? I mean, Liam pushed a leftover piece of broccoli across his plate with his fork, the left hand, and Nathan watched the fork and the slight tremor and the way Liam had learned to compensate for it without appearing to. I know it might not work, but it also might work. So okay. He looked up. Can we get a dog while we're doing the treatment, like for moral support? Nathan looked at his son for a long moment. We can discuss the dog, he said. That's a yes, Liam said immediately. That's always a yes. You only say discuss when you've already decided yes, but you want me to think I had input. Nathan opened his mouth and then closed it, because the kid was entirely right. Claire came to the apartment on a Saturday morning, 17 days after the subfloor corridor. She called first, 2 days before, and the call was short and practical. She asked if Saturday worked. Nathan said yes. She asked if Liam was comfortable with meeting new people. Nathan said he would explain who she was as a person rather than as a context, which Claire said was probably the right approach. He told Liam that the woman coming over was a scientist who worked on the medicine he was going to start on Monday. He said she was the one who had figured out how to make it work, had spent a long time on it, and that she wanted to meet him. Is she nice? Liam asked. Yeah, Nathan said. She's very direct. She doesn't have a lot of patience for things that waste time. She works a lot. She's pretty funny, actually, but she doesn't always know she's being funny. Liam considered this. Like you. I'm not funny. You're accidentally funny, Liam said. Like when you try to explain things and you use too many words and it loops back around to being funny. Nathan decided not to pursue this line of analysis. She arrived at 10 with a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks from the Meridian building, which meant she'd looked up the neighborhood, which was a very Claire thing to do, to locate the specific best option in a new context before showing up. The bag had a croissant in it, which she'd gotten because Nathan had told her, in a conversation about Liam's food preferences that she'd prompted with characteristic directness, that his son had a strong position on croissants. Liam opened the door and looked at her with the evaluative seriousness of a child who took meeting new people as an exercise requiring proper attention. Are you Dr. Bennett? He asked. Claire, she said. Dr. Bennett is for people I'm trying to impress. She held up the bag. I was told there was a croissant position in this household. Very strong position, Liam confirmed. He stepped back to let her in with the gravity of someone conducting admission protocol. Nathan watched from the kitchen doorway. He watched his son lead Claire to the kitchen table and explain his current comic book, a science fiction series about engineers on a generation ship. With the focused enthusiasm he brought to things he cared about, and he watched Claire sit down across from him and listen with the quality of attention she brought to things that mattered to her, asking questions that were actual questions and not adult, condescending to child questions, and he watched Liam register that distinction and calibrate accordingly. He made coffee. He brought 2 cups to the table and sat down, and for a while the 3 of them sat there in the kitchen, with the morning coming through the window and the comic book open between Liam and Claire and his son's left hand resting on the table, tremor faint and steady, and nobody mentioned it. The post-operation debrief from Voss arrived formally in the 3rd week, addressed to Claire as the named complainant in the federal case, but CC'd to Nathan at his own address, which Voss had obtained from the case file and which she had clearly sent deliberately. It was thorough and procedurally formatted and contained a section on the operational intelligence gathered from the case subjects that included, buried in paragraph 14, a single sentence about Richard Hargrove. Hargrove, the document stated, had been in federal custody for 9 days on charges related to this and 2 prior operations. He was cooperating with a broader investigation that was ongoing and whose scope the document did not detail. Nathan read the document once, top to bottom, and then put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept important papers, and went to pick up Liam from school. Liam had made a drawing in art class that day, marker on construction paper, the ambitious scale of a child who drew larger than the paper could contain, so that the rocket ship in the center was missing 1 engine that had run off the right edge. He showed it to Nathan in the car with the particular pride of someone who was aware of the technical limitation but had decided the concept outweighed it. The engine went off the side, Liam said, but it was implied. Implied engine, Nathan said. That's advanced engineering. It's more about the aesthetic, Liam explained. Nathan looked at the drawing, the enormous rocket, the implied engine, the stars that were all slightly different sizes, because Liam had a position on the fact that stars were not uniform, and the small figure in the rocket's window that was identifiably a kid in a helmet, looking out at the drawn stars with an expression that marker on construction paper somehow conveyed as wonder without irony. "It's good," Nathan said. "Really good." Liam looked at him. "You're not just saying that?" "No," Nathan said. "I mean it." Liam looked back at the drawing, and the small, satisfied expression moved across his face. Not pride exactly, more like confirmation, the look of someone whose internal assessment has been externally verified and found accurate. They drove home through afternoon traffic with the radio on low, and Nathan drove and Liam narrated the comic book plot he'd been explaining to Claire that morning, picking it up from somewhere in the middle and going forward, because he assumed Nathan had the context he needed, which was the assumption Liam always made about his father, that Nathan was paying attention, that Nathan had been listening, that whatever Liam needed to build on, Nathan already had the foundation ready. He was not wrong. There was a conversation Nathan and Claire had 10 days after her bakery bag visit to the apartment that neither of them had planned, and that happened because they'd both stayed late, her at the office, him in the building, old habits being slow to fully reform, and found themselves in the elevator at 8:15 going the same direction, which was down. Neither of them said anything for the first 2 floors. The elevator had a particular silence in the evenings, when the building had mostly emptied, a different quality than the daytime silence. More honest, somehow, less managed. "How was the first dosing session?" she asked. Liam had started the trial protocol 4 days ago. She'd asked Marcus to pull the trial coordinator's notes, which she technically had access to as chief executive of the sponsoring company, and which she was aware was a different category than asking as a person who was worried about a specific kid. "He threw up," Nathan said, "the first hour." "That's within the expected—" "I know," he said. He knew too, actually. I'd explained what the first session might feel like. He had a bucket ready. A pause. He was pissed about it, but he was prepared. There's a distinction. "That sounds exactly like him," she said. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. They walked out into the building's entrance hall, which was empty except for the night security guard doing his log entry. Outside, the city was doing its evening version of itself. Different light, different pace, the particular texture of a Thursday night on a street that wasn't quite nightlife, but wasn't quite ordinary anymore either. "I owe you something," Nathan said. She looked at him sideways. "No. Not as a transaction. I know what you said about that." I was quiet for a moment, working out the specific thing he needed to say, which was not easy because he was not constructed for the kind of communication that required exposing the thing being communicated rather than its operational implications. "I spent 6 months in this building watching out for you, and I was doing it for Liam. That's the truth. But somewhere in there it stopped being only for Liam." He paused. "I want you to know that, because you're about to be in my son's life in a significant way, as the person who made the medicine, and that's a thing that deserves honesty about where I'm standing." She was quiet for a moment. Across the street, a cab horn went off and went quiet. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him. "I'm also not simple about it. I'm aware it's complicated. I'm aware you have things you haven't told me yet about who you were before all this. And I'm aware Liam is the center of your world and should be. And I'm aware that I'm a person who works 70 hours a week and has trouble remembering to eat and once left a gas burner on for an entire day because I forgot I'd turned it on." She said this with the particular unflinching quality of a woman who had audited herself for long enough to be accurate about the results. "I'm not uncomplicated." "Neither am I," Nathan said. "Obviously," she said. They stood on the sidewalk outside the building where they'd met, where 6 months of watching and protecting and fighting through walls had happened, and the city moved around them with its usual enormous indifference. And Nathan looked at her in the way he'd been not quite looking at her for weeks, directly, without calculation, without the professional distance he'd constructed and maintained, just as a man looking at a person he'd come to know in conditions that had been extreme and real and had left him certain about things that ordinary conditions might have left ambiguous. "Coffee," he said. "Not tonight. When things are less—" He gestured at the general recent history. She looked at him. "Less operationally intense?" "Yeah. I can work with that," she said. "Autumn." The call from Voss came on a Tuesday, 4 weeks after the subfloor corridor. It was brief and informational, the kind of update Voss delivered with the professional efficiency of someone who'd learned that the people receiving her updates generally wanted the information and not the narrative around it. Hargrove had provided the full chain of command above him. 3 senior executives at entities connected to Orion Capital Partners had been indicted that morning. The operation was formally dismantled. Orion's investment fund had been frozen pending the financial crimes investigation, which meant the institutional shareholder position that had been aligned with Sutton's board majority was no longer a functional threat. "The name at the top," Voss said. "A man named Arthur Pline. He's 71 years old, he's been running this model for 12 years through 3 iterations, and he's currently in federal custody." She paused. "I wanted you to know." "Thank you," Nathan said. "The individual from your apartment," Voss said, meaning the one sent to stand outside Liam's bedroom. "He's pleaded guilty, 41 months. Nathan absorbed this. 41 months was a number. It was the system doing what it did, which was imperfect and structural, and the only mechanism available, which did not make it satisfying and also did not make it wrong. "Okay," he said. "One more thing," Voss said. "Off the record." "Go ahead." "The notebook," she said. "I know you said to keep it. I'm going to return it anyway, after the case closes, because I think you should have it." She paused. "Not as evidence, as a record of the thing you did." He started to say it wasn't necessary. "Nathan," she said, in a tone that was the first time she'd used his first name in all their conversations. "It was extraordinary, what you documented and what you did. I've been doing this work for 19 years. It was extraordinary." He looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the Tuesday afternoon was happening without any particular drama. A man walking a very slow old dog, a woman pushing a stroller, a teenager on a bicycle going too fast in the way teenagers did, continuous and unhurried and vast. "I was just paying attention," he said. "Most people don't," Voss said. "That's the whole thing, right there." She hung up. Nathan sat at the kitchen table in the Tuesday quiet and thought about the 6 weeks of the notebook, and the 6 months before that, and the 6 years before that, and the 8 years before those that he'd spent in a life whose relationship to the man sitting in this kitchen was both continuous and almost impossible to recognize as the same person. He thought about Liam, who was at school right now getting his weekly tremor assessment from the school nurse as part of the trial monitoring protocol, who had started the trial protocol 4 days ago and thrown up in the first hour and had been pissed about it but prepared, who had a drawing of a rocket with an implied engine on the refrigerator door and a strong position on croissants and a gap-toothed grin that was going to be there long after the gap filled in. He thought about Claire, who had built a drug in a building full of people who wanted it to fail, and who had done it anyway, had kept doing it without the knowledge that someone was watching the walls while she worked, had earned the thing she was building without any assistance from the man who'd quietly arranged his entire life around making sure she survived long enough to finish building it. He thought about all of it without trying to resolve it into a cleaner shape, because it wasn't a clean shape and hadn't been for a long time. And maybe that was all right. Maybe the shape a life took when it was actually being lived, rather than being managed from a careful distance, was always going to be irregular and marked and occasionally implied rather than complete, like an engine that had run off the edge of the paper. He stood up, rinsed his coffee cup, put it in the rack beside the chipped cereal bowl. Then he went to pick up his son from school, because it was 3:30 and that was what 3:30 meant. And some rhythms were the structure that held everything else in place, and he had no intention of giving this one up. The 8th week of Liam's trial protocol fell on a Thursday in early April, which meant the monitoring appointment was at 9 in the morning, and Nathan had rearranged his entire schedule around it without being asked to, the way he rearranged everything around Liam's medical appointments, with the quiet, systematic efficiency of a man who had long ago decided that certain things were non-negotiable and had organized his life outward from that decision. Dr. Angaran the cerebellar assessment with the focused attention of a clinician who understood that the people sitting across from him in these appointments had been holding their breath for 8 weeks. and deserved the specific courtesy of not being made to wait any longer than necessary for information he already had. Liam sat on the examination table in his socks. He'd taken his shoes off without being asked, another one of his small courtesies, the habit of someone who'd been in enough medical offices to understand the rhythm of them, and looked at Dr. Huang with the particular directness he brought to things he needed to know the truth about. "So?" Liam said. Huang looked at his tablet, then he looked at Liam. Then he smiled, and it was not the careful managed smile of a doctor delivering complicated news. It was the smile of someone who got to say something good and knew it. "The degradation markers," Huang said, "are down 43% from your baseline reading 8 weeks ago." Liam looked at him. "What does that mean in regular words?" "It means the medicine is working," Huang said. "Better than we projected, actually. The progression has not just slowed. In several of the key indicators, it's reversed." The room was very quiet for a moment. Nathan was sitting in the chair beside the examination table, the chair that had been the same chair in every medical office for 2 years, the chair positioned slightly to the side and behind, the chair of a parent who needed to be present without being in the way. And he looked at his son, and his son looked at him, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Liam's face did something that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and was, in the specific way of 8-year-olds processing things too large to fit neatly into a single expression, both at once. "Okay," Liam said, with enormous effort at composure that Nathan recognized as his own composure, the composure he'd modeled in this kid for years without knowing he was modeling it. "Okay, good." "Yeah," Nathan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended it to. "Good." Liam looked at the ceiling for a second, blinked twice, looked back at Huang. "Will I have to keep taking it?" "We'll continue the protocol for another 6 months and monitor," Huang said. "If the markers continue in this direction, which the data strongly suggests they will, the long-term prognosis is substantially better than anything we could have offered you before this trial." He paused. "I want to be honest with you, Liam. I always will be. That's a promise I make to my patients. There's still work to do. We're not finished, but you're on the right road." "The right road is better than the wrong road," Liam said. "Yes," Huang said, "considerably." On the drive home, Liam was quiet for the first 10 minutes, looking out the passenger window at the city moving past, processing the way he processed things. Internally first, questions later, the questions arriving when he'd organized whatever he needed to organize before he could ask them clearly. Then, "Dad." "Yeah." "Did you know it was going to work?" He wasn't accusing. He was asking with genuine curiosity, the tone of someone trying to understand the sequence of events that had led to the current moment. Nathan thought about how to answer that. He thought about 4 months of researching a drug in a library on a public computer, about 6 months of pushing a cart through corridors. He'd memorized the way he'd once memorized hostile terrain, about a composition notebook full of badge numbers and access log entries, and the particular stubborn conviction that if the thing could be protected, it would be worth protecting. "I knew it was real," he said. "I knew the person who made it was the real thing. I thought if it had a fair chance it would work." He glanced at his son. "I didn't know. I hoped." Liam absorbed this. "You did a lot for a hope." "You do a lot for a hope," Nathan said. "That's the only thing hopes respond to." Liam was quiet for another block. Then, "Can we tell Claire?" Nathan looked at the road. "Yeah," he said. "We can tell Claire." Well, she was in a meeting when Nathan texted. She came out of the meeting 4 minutes later, which Marcus noted was unprecedented, and stood in the hallway outside the conference room, reading her phone with an expression Marcus had never seen on her face before, and would later describe to his girlfriend as the expression of someone who had just confirmed that a thing they'd built their life around was actually, genuinely real. She called Nathan back immediately. He answered on the first ring. 43%, he said, before she could speak. "I know," she said. "Huang's coordinator sent the trial data an hour ago. I've been in a meeting." Her voice had the particular stripped quality of someone who had decided not to manage what they were feeling right now. "Nathan." "I know," he said. They were quiet on the phone for a moment, together in the silence the way two people can be together in a silence when the silence is full of the same thing. "He wants to tell you himself," Nathan said. "He made that clear. He said," a pause, and under it something that was unmistakably warm and unmistakably struggling against itself. He said, "You did the hard part." He wanted to say thank you to the person who did the hard part. She pressed her free hand flat against the hallway wall, just for a second, just to have something solid to push against. "I'll come Friday," she said. "If that works?" "Friday works," Nathan said. Oh. The MBX-7 regulatory approval came on a Wednesday morning in late May, 14 weeks after the federal investigation had concluded and the clean submission had cleared its final review stage. Claire was at her desk when the notification came through from their regulatory affairs coordinator, and the notification was a single line in an email with a document attached, and the document was the approval. She read the email 3 times. Then she called Dr. Ito. He picked up on the second ring. "I know," he said, before she could speak, because the coordinator had sent the notification to the full trial team simultaneously. His voice was doing the thing that Kenji Ito's voice almost never did. It was unsteady, not with grief, but with the release of something held under significant pressure for a very long time. "Claire, we did it." "We did it," she said. There was a pause on the line that had the specific texture of 2 people who had spent 3 years building something together, arriving at the moment where the building was done, and discovering that the arrival felt both exactly as significant as they'd known it would and entirely different from anything they'd been able to fully imagine. "The pricing structure holds?" Ito asked. He meant the charter protections she'd locked in, the ones that kept MBX-7 accessible to families outside the private insurance tier, the ones that Orion Capital Partners had spent 18 months trying to dismantle from the inside before an 8-year-old boy's father with a composition notebook had dismantled them instead. "The pricing structure holds," she said. "I had the legal team recertify it last month. It's in the company charter, the supply agreements, and the manufacturing contracts. It would take an act of legal catastrophe to undo at this point, and I've made sure it would be expensive enough to try that nobody's going to try." Ito exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who had gone to bed worried about this specific thing for more nights than he'd counted. "Good," he said. "That's the whole point, isn't it? That's what it was always for." "Yes," she said. "That's what it was always for." She ended the call and sat for a moment in her office with the approval document open on her screen, and she thought about a conversation she'd had with her father when she was 19 and had told him she wanted to go into pharmaceutical research, specifically into the territory of rare pediatric neurological conditions, which was not the territory you went into if your primary goal was financial security or professional prestige or any of the markers her father's generation had been taught to pursue. Her father had been a practical man, a structural engineer, someone who understood the world in terms of load-bearing capacity and material limits, and the honest relationship between what you built and what it could hold. He'd listened to her explain the research she wanted to do, and then he'd said something she'd never fully let go of. The most important structures are the ones that hold up for people who have no other structure available. She hadn't thought about that conversation in years. It came back to her now, sitting in the office where she'd spent 3 years making something that had no guarantee of success, that had been attacked from 3 directions by people who had the resources to sustain the attack, that had survived because of work she'd done, and because of a man who'd quietly arranged his life to keep her standing long enough to do it. She picked up her phone and texted Nathan. "It's approved." His response came back in 40 seconds. "I know. Liam wants to know if this is a cake occasion." She looked at the message for a moment, and the laugh that came out of her was not a managed or professional thing. It was the genuine article, the laugh of someone who had been holding a great deal of weight for a great deal of time and had just set it down somewhere permanent. She typed back, "Tell him absolutely yes. The biggest cake available." The celebration at the apartment that evening was not elegant. Nathan had gotten a grocery store cake because the bakery he'd tried to call had closed early on Wednesdays, which he'd discovered too late. And the grocery store cake was white with blue frosting flowers and a border that read "Congratulations" in letters that were slightly uneven because the decorator had apparently run low on space toward the right side. Liam had insisted on putting candles on it despite the absence of any birthday, his argument being that candles were appropriate for any occasion involving significant achievement, which was not an argument Nathan had been able to counter effectively. Claire arrived at 6 with Dr. Ito, whom she'd brought because he was the person most responsible for the drug existing after Claire herself, and because she'd called him after the grocery cake text and he'd been sitting in his office staring at the approval document and she'd said, "Come have cake," and he'd said he didn't want to intrude, and she'd said, "Kenji, come have cake." He arrived with his wife, a quiet woman named Yuki, who taught elementary school, and who immediately understood the energy of the apartment and sat down next to Liam and asked about the rocket drawing on the refrigerator with the specific, genuine curiosity of a person who spent her days with children and had never lost the habit of taking what they made seriously. Liam explained the implied engine at significant length. Yuki asked excellent follow-up questions. Nathan's mother, Patricia, had driven up from Richmond for what she'd described on the phone as no particular reason and what was obviously every reason, and she stood in the kitchen with Nathan while he cut the cake, and she looked at the people in her son's living room. The scientist who'd built the drug, the researcher who'd made it work, a school teacher asking about a rocket drawing, a small boy explaining the aesthetic reasoning behind an off-page engine. And she put her hand on Nathan's arm for a moment, the way she'd put her hand on his face that terrible night in the apartment. "This is good," she said quietly. Not with surprise, with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this specific version of her son's life to become possible and was now watching it happen. "Yeah," Nathan said. He was cutting the cake with the focused attention he gave most manual tasks, which was not because he was awkward about the moment, but because he was the kind of man who found it easier to feel the weight of things when his hands had something to do. "It is." She went to help Yuki and Liam with whatever they were now drawing together on a piece of paper. Yuki had produced a pen from her purse, and they appeared to be designing an updated rocket. And Nathan put the cake slices on plates and thought about what his mother had said. "This is good." It was such a simple sentence. It had taken him a long time to get here, and the path had not been simple, and there had been years in the middle of it that were the opposite of this kitchen, and this cake, and these people. Years that he still carried in ways that didn't always show but were present. The way old structural damage is present in a building that's been repaired. You can't see it from the outside, the building stands fine, but the person who knows the building knows where the repair work is. He thought about the 8 years in the Navy, about the classified operation that had taken 3 people he had trusted completely and given back none of them. He thought about the years after, the slow and entirely unglamorous work of becoming a person who could raise a child, rather than a person defined by the things he was capable of doing to other people. He thought about a parking garage at 6 in the evening and 4 men in tactical gear and a woman pressed against a concrete pillar with her laptop clutched to her chest who had not screamed, who had looked at him afterward with the clear-eyed attention of someone trying to understand something real rather than something comfortable. I thought about the fact that this, the kitchen, the bad cake, the implied engine, Liam's laugh from the other room, was the thing the parking garage had been for. Not in any grand or faded sense, just in the simple operational sense of, this is what the work was protecting, this is what the walls were holding up. He brought the cake slices to the table. Well, after Ito and Yuki had gone home, after Patricia had settled into the guest room with the efficiency of a woman who had her own toiletries in the medicine cabinet because she stayed enough nights to justify the storage, after Liam had gone to bed, in the slightly elevated state of a kid who'd had cake and good company and would probably lie awake for another 40 minutes thinking about rockets before sleep took him, Nathan and Claire sat on the small balcony off the apartment's living room. The balcony was not a balcony in any aspirational sense. It was a concrete ledge with room for 2 chairs and a dead plant in a pot that Nathan had been meaning to address for some time. The city ran its evening version of itself below and around them, indifferent and continuous and enormous, doing what cities did. Claire had her hands around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Nathan had his elbows on the railing, looking at the street below, at the particular quality of city light at 9 in the evening. Not dark, never fully dark in a city, but a different shade of alive than the daytime, quieter in its business. "I have something to ask you," Claire said. "You can say no." He looked at her sideways. "Okay." "The foundation," she said. The Meridian Medical Foundation was the nonprofit structure she'd established to manage MBX7's distribution and access programs, the mechanism through which the charter pricing protections were operationally implemented. It was separate from the company, deliberately, legally separated, so that whatever happened to the company's commercial structure could not touch the Foundation's mandate. "I'm building out a security and operations division, for the research assets, for the facilities, for the people who work in the places where the research happens." She paused. I want to protect what we built, permanently. Not with contractors who have loyalties I can't verify. Not with a security apparatus that reports to a board I don't fully control. I want someone who understands what the work is for. Nathan looked at the street below for a moment. Director of Security and Emergency Operations, she said. I know you haven't been a director of anything in 6 years. I know the title is not the point for you. The point is the work. She paused. The work is protecting research that saves children. That's what it is, stripped down. I can't think of a better match. He was quiet for long enough that a cab went by below, and a couple walked past on the sidewalk, arguing amicably about something neither of them could hear, and the dead plant in the pot rustled faintly in a breeze. I'd need to be home at 3:30, he said, for school pickup. The position doesn't have fixed hours, she said. It has responsibilities. You manage how you meet them. And if there's ever a conflict between the work and Liam, there's no version of this where Liam is not the first priority, she said. That's not a negotiation point. It's the baseline. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the directness she brought to everything that mattered to her. Not pushing, not performing, just present in the way of a person who had made a decision and was stating it clearly. Okay, he said. Okay, yes, or okay, I'll think about it. Okay, yes, he said. She nodded. Looked back at the city. The coffee cup in her hands was completely cold now, and she held it anyway. You're going to have to get a proper badge, she said. Not a maintenance badge. I'll manage. And an office. I've already picked one. It's on the 4th floor. It has a window that faces the street, so you can see the entrance from it. He looked at her. You already picked the office. I made a decision, she said. I followed through on it. That's how I work. I know how you work, he said. I know you do, she said. Below them, the city kept going. A bus, 2 teenagers on bicycles, an old man walking the same slow old dog from the afternoon, apparently still going, or going again. Nathan couldn't tell which. 6 months later, Liam's cerebellar markers were down 61% from baseline. Dr. Huang delivered the number with the same careful honesty he always used, which meant he said it was extraordinary, and he also said there was still ongoing monitoring required, and he also said they were not going to get ahead of the data. Liam had listened to the careful honesty and then said, with the precision of an 8-year-old who had learned to parse medical language for its actual content. But it's really, really good, right? It's really, really good, Huang confirmed. Liam's left hand on the examination table was still. Not the carefully managed stillness Nathan had watched for 2 years. Not the compensation and the adjusted grip and the deliberate placement of a hand that knew it might betray something. Just still. Just a kid's hand, sitting there. Nathan looked at it for a moment, then looked at the ceiling, and whatever happened on his face in that second was private and brief, and then it was gone. On the way home, they stopped at the bakery, not the grocery store, the actual bakery, and got croissants. 2 chocolate, 1 almond, because Nathan had developed, without fully acknowledging it, a preference for the almond that Liam viewed as nutritionally irresponsible and had opinions about. They sat on a bench outside the bakery with the croissants and the morning around them, and Liam ate with the unself-conscious appetite of a kid who felt good, who had slept well, who had woken up that morning and run down the hallway to the kitchen in the way he'd started running again over the past 2 months. The running that had come back quietly, not announced. Just one morning, there it was, and Nathan had stood in the kitchen doorway watching it, and had not said anything because some things don't need to be said. Dad, Liam said through a mouthful of croissant. Don't talk with your mouth full. He swallowed. Is Claire coming for dinner Friday? She said she'd try. She always says she'll try. She usually makes it. Liam considered this. I think she should just say she's coming instead of she'll try, because she always comes. So the trying part is just extra words. Nathan looked at his son. She has a lot happening. The try is her being honest about uncertainty. I know, Liam said, but she doesn't have to be uncertain about us. He said it simply, not as a profound statement, just as a logistical observation from a 9-year-old. He had turned 9 in March with a bakery cake this time, a real one with properly spaced letters, who was describing something he'd already decided was true and thought it would be useful to make explicit. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. I'll tell her that, he said. Tell her from me, Liam said, so she knows it's not just you. He told her on Friday, She came for dinner, made it, not just tried, and they ate at the kitchen table with the kind of meal Nathan cooked, which was solid and simple and better than it looked because he'd learned to cook the way he'd learned most practical things by doing it until it worked without any particular drama about the learning curve. After Liam had gone to bed, Nathan told her what Liam had said on the bench outside the bakery. She was quiet for a moment. "He said I don't have to be uncertain about you," she said. "About us," Nathan said. His word. She looked at the kitchen table, at the plates that hadn't been cleared yet, at the small evidence of a meal eaten by people who were comfortable enough with each other not to perform tidiness in real time. She looked at the chipped cereal bowl still in the drying rack, because it lived there now. It was a permanent feature of this kitchen. She looked at the rocket drawing on the refrigerator, which had been joined over the past months by several more drawings in the same ambitious scale. Exceeds paper style, forming a gallery of implied engines and stars of various sizes, and one particularly large drawing of what Liam said was a deep-sea research vessel, but which looked, to everyone including Liam, primarily like a very confident rectangle. "He's going to be okay," she said. It was not a question. "He's going to be okay," Nathan said. "Not because everything worked out perfectly. Because he's a sturdy kid. He's always been a sturdy kid. The medicine is giving him room to be what he already was." She looked at Nathan. In the kitchen light, with the dinner plates still on the table and the dead plant no longer dead, he'd repotted it 2 months ago, some kind of resilient indoor thing that had recovered so aggressively it now occupied a third of the balcony. He looked like a person who had arrived somewhere and knew it. Not relaxed exactly, because she suspected he was not a man who would ever be fully relaxed in the way some people were, the easy, open-palmed variety of relaxed. More like settled. Weight distributed correctly at last after years of compensating for an uneven load. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "I'm not uncertain," she said. "About this. About—" She gestured, a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen and the drawings on the refrigerator and the direction of Liam's room, and the two of them sitting at the table on a Friday night like people who did this regularly, which they did. "I'm a person who hedges on things until I have enough data to stop hedging. I have enough data now." He looked at her for a moment. "That's the most clear way to say that I could have imagined." "I know," she said. "I thought you'd appreciate the precision." "I do," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The right hand, the one with the old scar across 2 knuckles that reopened on contact, that had reopened twice more in the months since the parking garage, and would probably keep reopening because some things healed to a point and held there, functional and marked, which was its own kind of fine. She held his hand and he turned his palm up and held hers back. And it was not a small thing, it was not a simple thing, but it was the right thing, and sometimes that was the whole story. There is a thing that people who have lived through extended periods of danger or loss often discover, if they're lucky enough to discover anything at all, which is this. The life on the other side of it is not the life they imagined while they were in the middle of it. Not better or worse, necessarily. Just different, more specific. Less about the absence of bad things and more about the presence of ordinary ones. The chipped bowl, the gallery of 2 large drawings, the kid running down the hallway in the morning because he can, the bakery instead of the grocery store, the dead plant that came back. Nathan Wolfe had spent 6 years making himself invisible in order to protect the only thing that had ever mattered to him without question, and in doing so had accidentally protected several other things as well. A drug, a woman, a body of research that would go on to reach 437 children in its first year of availability. Children in cities he'd never been to and families he'd never meet. Children whose names he didn't know and whose lives he would have no visibility into and who would never know that a man who had once been a different kind of person had pushed a cart with a bad wheel through corridors. Nobody watched for 6 months and kept very careful notes. He didn't think about those 437 children in any grand or deliberate way. He was not built for grand or deliberate. He thought about them the way you think about consequences that have moved beyond your visibility. Knowing they're there, not needing to see them to believe in them. What he thought about, concretely and daily, was the 9-year-old boy who woke up in the room down the hall and ran to the kitchen and had opinions about cereal and designed spacecraft with implied components, and was currently in the early stages of a campaign for a dog that Nathan had begun privately to accept was going to succeed because the arguments were simply too coherent to counter indefinitely. He thought about a woman who worked too many hours and forgot to eat, and had built something real in a world that had tried 3 times to stop her and had failed 3 times because she was not stoppable, not through institutional means, not through criminal ones, not through the ordinary erosion of exhaustion and doubt that wore most people down, because she'd started from a position of caring more about the work than about herself, which was not a healthy long-term strategy, but which had, in this specific case, produced something that outlasted the people who'd tried to bury it. He thought about what it meant to protect something, not the mechanics of it, the notebooks and the badge numbers and the 4 men on a parking garage floor, the underneath of it. The reason you do it, when doing it costs everything you have and there's no guarantee it pays off. You do it because the alternative is a world where the thing you're protecting doesn't exist, and that world is worse, and you've decided you're not willing to accept it. It's not heroism. It's not selflessness. It's just a choice, made in a moment when choices are available, and then made again the next morning and the morning after that. Until one morning you're standing in a kitchen with the approval document on a screen in a building across town, and a child running down a hallway, and a woman coming for dinner on Friday, and the choice has accumulated into a life. That's all it ever is. A choice accumulated. Made badly some of the time, made well enough most of the time, made again regardless. On a Sunday in October, 6 months after the approval and almost exactly a year after the parking garage, Nathan took Liam to a park 2 miles from the apartment. Claire came. His mother was in town and came too, which was becoming a more regular occurrence that everyone pretended was coincidental and no one actually believed was coincidental. Liam ran across the grass toward the climbing structure with the specific full commitment sprint of a child who has decided that distance is an obstacle to be resolved as quickly as possible. His arms pumping, his sneakers hitting the grass with the solid, uncomplicated sound of someone who is not measuring the distance between where they are and where they're going, who is just going. Nathan stood at the edge of the grass and watched his son run. Behind him, Claire was saying something to his mother. He could hear their voices, the easy rhythm of 2 people who had found their way to genuine comfort with each other over months of Friday dinners and weekend mornings, and all the small accumulated ordinary occasions that built the thing that couldn't be planned for, only inhabited. He heard his mother laugh. He heard Claire's response, which was drier and shorter and prompted his mother to laugh again. He kept watching Liam. The boy had reached the climbing structure and was already halfway up it, moving with the cheerful imprecision of a kid whose coordination was still finding itself, grabbing the wrong handhold and correcting, nearly losing a foothold and catching himself, going up anyway. At the top, he turned around and looked back across the park, located his father at the edge of the grass, and raised one hand in a wave that was also, clearly, a declaration. Nathan raised his hand back. He stood there in the October morning with the city moving around the edges of the park, and the grass wet from the night's rain, and his son at the top of a climbing structure, waving, and he thought about all the versions of this moment that had not been possible a year ago. The versions he'd allowed himself to hope for without quite letting himself believe in. The way you hope for a thing you're not sure you've earned the right to expect. He had not earned this. That was the thing he'd had to accept, eventually, that you didn't earn your way to the ordinary good things any more than you earned your way out of the bad ones. You fought for the conditions under which they became possible. The rest was out of your hands. He was okay with what was out of his hands. Claire came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Liam up on the climbing structure, and then she looked at Nathan, and the look had in it everything they hadn't said yet, and several things they had, and the easy weight of a relationship that had been built in the wrong order. Crisis first, then trust, then the slow, careful work of becoming people to each other, rather than people defined by a shared emergency, and was still standing. "He's going too fast," she said. "He's fine," Nathan said. "He's going to fall. He'll catch himself. And if he doesn't, then he gets up," Nathan said. "That's what he does." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, everything that had happened in a parking garage and a subfloor corridor and a federal interview room and a kitchen on a Friday night was present without needing to be named, the way structural work is present in a building that's been repaired. Invisible from the outside, load-bearing, essential. Liam came down the climbing structure at full speed, landed in the wood chip border at the bottom with more confidence than technique, stumbled once, caught himself on his own 2 feet, and turned around to see if anyone had noticed. Both of them had noticed. He grinned. The gap was gone now, the adult teeth all the way in, but the grin was the same grin, wide and uncomplicated and certain of its welcome, and ran toward the next thing, whatever it was, whatever the park contained that he hadn't gotten to yet. Nathan watched him go. He thought, this is what I was holding the walls up for. Not the grand resolution, not the approval document or the federal case or any of it. This specific boy running across this specific grass in the ordinary October morning, with the whole day still ahead, and nothing, for once, bearing down on it. That was the mission. That had always been the mission. He watched his son run, and the watching was enough, and the morning was enough. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, enough was genuinely, completely